Monster Hunter lore is infamous for being a little impenetrable. Between numerous untranslated lore books, to troves of non-repeatable NPC dialogue, to decades of fan canon seeping into every public conversation, it can be quite tough to get a general understanding of what is and isn't true, and where the baseline of this world's lore is. The other day, fellow lore master My Name is Bife, whom you might know from his work on the Destiny games, was in that exact same position, and approached me to have a casual chat about the basics of Monster Hunter lore, dispelling some common misconceptions, and asking me my takes on some controversial topics within that subculture. We recorded our talk for you to listen to here, and I hope you enjoy it. I should warn you though, this conversation includes full story spoilers for Monster Hunter Wilds. That being said, thank you for watching and have fun.
I think to start off with though, I need to say thank you so much for agreeing to take a moment to sit down and talk.
Absolutely, I'm very, very jazzed to be here. I was very happy to see your message, because as I replied to you as well, I've been kind of thinking of doing like a here are the lore basics kind of video since forever. It's just that the basics are unbelievably broad. So I think a conversation like that is such a wonderful opportunity to get this done finally. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I should really start with the note of, I discussed just a few minutes ago how this is very much a conversation between someone who is a subject matter expert and then me, who is, I should probably discuss where my knowledge on things is, because I played World, I played Wilds, I skipped out on Rise, but it is very much one of those things where Monster Hunter has been there for me in my childhood. So I was playing on the PSP, and I went ahead and got a bunch of the games there, and then when eventually it came to World, it was this kind of rediscovery of this old passion. So there are some old things that I've done, and I know in one, I think it was actually Freedom, or Freedom Unite, one of them I got all the way up to Fatalis, but I never went any further than that. So it's just, there's a lot of experience behind some of my early experiences and the times I've played the game, but it's not. It is not a foundational knowledge base as far as the lore is concerned. It's the, I kind of remember that kind of base of knowledge that I'm sure some people have, and it's, I know bits and pieces, but it's not enough to sit there and say that I know things definitively. And this was kind of, when I first made content and did my research and whatnot, this started to become rather obvious and started to get shown, especially in the later videos that I've made on Monster Hunter here or there. I just kept on getting a lot of questions about what is and isn't canon, and a lot of people telling me, sitting there and being like, hey, it's great that you're covering this, but there's a lot of misconceptions and things that have changed. And this is kind of what ultimately brought me to you in the first place, is just, there is a lot of misconceptions out there with regards to the lore of Monster Hunter, and I think it's nice to be able to go ahead and clear some of those up.
Absolutely, and I think your story with sort of how you got into Monster Hunter, and especially sort of your level of confidence with the lore, is probably what I reckon 90% of people are at. This feeling of, well, I've played the games and I've read dialogue, I have participated in this community for a while, and there are these sporadic things that I remember that are filtered through my memory and through thousands of hours of game time. That is, I think, where most people are at, and that's obviously totally fine. And obviously Freedom Unite being the starting point for so many different people also just colors the knowledge of the lore quite significantly, because Freedom Unite, despite being so popular and in a lot of people's minds is the pillar of old or classic Monster Hunter, is itself already, or was itself already, a modernization of the actual original pair of Monster Hunter games, Monster Hunter 1 and Monster Hunter DOS. So, I'm very glad that you asked me to be here, but don't feel like you did anything wrong or that you got something horribly misunderstood, because it really is just kind of where most people are at. And we'll talk about why that is and how that is slowly getting better thanks to some real concentrated fan efforts, but it's a lot. Spoiler alert, it's a lot.
I will leave those particular judgments to everyone in the YouTube comments when inevitably I get something wrong. You know what? That's fine, because ultimately,
You've got my seal of approval, and that's what matters.
Ah, my gosh. Okay, there we go, everybody. The Ocean seal of approval.
Exactly.
Oceaniz. I know you said you didn't mind how it pronounced, but I'm always going to be a bit conscious of that.
All good, all good.
Okay, so from everything, I wanted to go ahead and jump in with a few of the questions that I sent you in advance.
Yes.
Starting off with the first one, and this kind of leads on perfectly from where we were just in our conversation, is basically, where should people go in order to find the lore? The obvious answer, of course, is the games. But there's a lot of stuff which is not really stated within the games, or it's kind of buried behind hundreds or thousands of hours worth of gameplay. And there's also alternate sources of games lore with just any franchise. So what's the place to go ahead and get Monster Hunter lore? I know there's old art books, I know there's books about the world of Monster Hunter, but also I hear about a new fan-curated wiki.
Yeah, a fan-curated wiki I'm a part of, so I can definitely recommend it. But I think the best way to start with this is to just give you a little overview of how lore even works in Monster Hunter.
Yeah, perfect.
So,
go for it.
Yeah. So in Japanese, the word that they use for lore is actually something closer to worldview or setting view. And that is, and specifically in Monster Hunter, and that is, I think, a better way to think of it, is that these games have just this sort of outlook on their worlds and mythologies that are very specific to each game, but still connected. So that's your first hurdle. How do you explain that to someone concisely? That each game is connected, but they all have like a slightly different viewpoint on the world. Problem number one. Problem number two, as you mentioned, there's a lot of lore in the games, and the games do not have repeatable dialogue most of the time. And there's a lot of dialogue, and I'm sure you've experienced that, I'm sure everyone listening has experienced this, where you're just mashing those buttons to try and get to the next hunt. You just aren't reading anything because the game hasn't taught you to care about reading it. And that creates the next hurdle, where there is lore in these games, but it's just not easily accessible unless you have a full game script, which obviously takes time to assemble. It is one of the projects on the wiki, but you know, God knows when that's going to be done. So that's the games. The next problem is that Monster Hunter has released a lot of books. A lot of books. I have a little shelf next to me in my office here, and I'm looking at about 30 books, all just Monster Hunter related.
Whoa,
some of them art books. Yeah.
Okay. Whoa. My
Yeah.
goodness. Okay.
Some of them art books, some of them dedicated lore books, some of them interview books, some of them collections of like notes taken during conventions. There's a lot of print media on Monster Hunter, and it is all kind of relevant if you want to get a good grasp of the full picture. And the next problem is that of those many books, there's been exactly 4 that have been translated into English, 3 of which are just art books. Art books that, I want to note, have kind of a shoddy translation that isn't super useful if you're trying to get like the real answers to anything. So yeah, it's not an exceptionally good situation if you, as a Western fan, want to get into the lore. There just isn't an easy and quick answer for me to give. What is complicated by this, or what complicates this further, is that the lore books, let's say you've got it, and you are trying your best to like read through the Japanese, you're using translation software, you're using Google Lens, whatever. All Monster Hunter lore books are written from an in-universe perspective. They are, yes, they are essentially treated as if they are books released by the Hunters Guild. That is extremely cool. It's one of my favorite things about it. It introduces unreliable narration.
Yes, of course, which is, I mean, in a certain sense, picks up kind of from where the games are.
Yeah. And it also introduces a degree of historical confusion when you want to try and figure out things about, like, the history of the world of Monster Hunter. You need to be aware that what you're reading is not an objective account of what happened. It is filtered through this lens of some guy in the Royal Academy or in the Hunters Guild reading old documents and giving you his take. And this is, again, something you need to actually pick up on through reading the Japanese text, which, especially early on, a lot of people did not.
Hmm.
And then
So perspectives ended up getting stated as fact. Very familiar with this on my wheelhouse on the other end of things. It's mistakes I've made during my career too when it comes to other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, ambiguity is one of those things that we all sort of believe we can pick up on. But it's harder than one thinks when you're, scouring texts and trying to find the right answer, and you find one thing that fits the thing you already sort of believe, and you go, yes, that must be it. And then it's actually, well, it's way more ambiguous than that, way more unsure. So yeah, don't worry. I've made I've made a lot of bad calls in that regard as well in my past videos. But we live and learn.
Mm-hmm. Life is a process. Knowledge is a road, is the way I've come to talk about it, Very nice. Very wise. But yeah, I mean, on that note of things, it's good to know that the barriers are kind of what I anticipated to a small extent, but it's crazy to see just how thick those barriers end up being, because obviously there was always going to be a localization barrier. And for those who are not aware, which I think hopefully is obvious by this point, Monster Hunter is a game originally for Japanese, which means all the languages we play in the West, they're localized.
Yep.
And then, of course, as you talked about, 30-odd books with different statements on the lore, and then everything in between with dialogue that's inaccessible. Gosh, the challenges are exactly what I anticipated, but it's crazy to sit there and think about how much of it that actually represents. And also, how many games there actually are, which I think is a... Yeah, I mean, what? 1, 2, Freedom Unite, and then Try, and a button 4, 4G, World, Wilds, Rise. I mean, it really does end up being kind of expansive beyond the point of being able to keep in one's head. And then for all of that, there's things like, what is it, Monster Hunter Try or something, where the servers are shut down because it was online?
Yes. There's definitely a preservation issue as well, where pretty much any Monster Hunter game older than Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, which is just the newest Monster Hunter game you can currently buy on the Switch that isn't called Rise, anything older than that has had its servers shut down, which is not a problem for most of them, except for Monster Hunter 1, 2, and 3, because those 3 games had entire towns that were only accessible in the online mode. And that all, of course, was at the risk of getting lost. Now, thanks to the Monster Hunter Old School project, all of that has been restored. Wow. Yeah, you can play Monster Hunter 2 or 1 or 3 online today if you want. It is actually quite simple to set up. I personally played Monster Hunter 2 that way. But yeah, the problem there is also that you have a bunch of games, as you mentioned. We are looking, I believe it's something like 12 core series games, if you don't count any spin-offs and MMOs and whatnot. And then you get into the trouble of certain games haven't even released in English. Most notably Monster Hunter 2, which is a problem because Monster Hunter 2 is one of the most important games for the lore. It's the game where you get to visit what you could call the capital city of Monster Hunter.
What? Oh my god! I did not even realize that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Although I should say, the Monster Hunter Old School project also comes with an excellent fan translation patch for Monster Hunter 2. Again, can highly recommend the Break Arts version of the game.
For that note, really quickly, where can people go ahead and find that? Because I know for a fact that if nostalgia bites, I would love to go ahead and go back to run the old games like that. So yeah.
So there is. Let me check what it's called. I believe it's just called MH Old School. Yeah, it's an old school forum that was actually built very recently. I'm just gonna send you the link right here in Discord. And this should have all the resources you need to get started with anything. If you have legitimate copies of the games, you can set them up to work with the fan servers, and of course with the translations. And I can really recommend it if you have the time and the energy to set it up. It's a great way to experience these games that are genuinely kind of lost to time now. You are not capable to play Monster Hunter 2 at all in the West outside of this, which is crazy.
Well, in that case, I will go ahead and leave this link in the comments for anyone who is interested, because for real, this treasure trove of old games is, I mean, I need to go back and re-experience part of my childhood aside from anything else, but there's also foundational bits and pieces to the lore when it comes to that. It's touching on things later, but I remember some of the first entries in like Hunter magazines within the game that you could read, and then touching on things like, you know, the Kingdom of Strayed and Fatalis and Black Dragons and all that.
Yes, yes, of course. And also, Monster Hunter 1 and 2 are especially interesting just to also see from a mechanical perspective what has actually stayed the same and what has changed. For example, Wilds' recent season mechanic is something that they took from Monster Hunter 2. So, you know, if you want to see an early version of that take, Monster Hunter 2 is right there for you.
Absolutely. And with that note, you also mentioned the fan-curated wiki. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, so the fan-curated wiki, which is monsterhunterwiki.org, a couple of people have started calling it the Oceaniz wiki, which is not what it's called, and I do not own it, I just contribute to it. It is essentially an attempt to build a new wiki for the game that is divorced from both the fandom and the Fextra Life wikis, as both of them have they're in a state that seems hard to fix, with some fundamental issues that are unlikely to get addressed soon. So I want to say, when was it? Probably about a year and a half ago, I got contacted by Yuzuchi, who's the creator of this new wiki, to come on board and help out. And that's what I've been doing since. We went public a couple of months ago, and we are now happily like filling out pages with all sorts of stuff. You got people who are data wizards, who are like, you know, finding all the drop rates and all that stuff, who are transcribing dialogue from the games. We've got people who are finding all of the books. We have found a lot of old lore and art books that nobody really knew about. We've been scouring like Japanese markets to make that happen. One of my close collaborators, user Zugzwang, has built an enormous library of books that puts mine to shame. So it's kind of an all-sided effort to just get as much information about this game series like up and running and available for people. My role specifically on the wiki is that I'm a lore guy. Surprise, surprise. So I get to write lore pages for monsters, and I get to hound people about their writing and ask them, where's the source on this, please? So, you know, it's still being built. We're still sort of trying to catch up because, as we established, there's a lot to cover. Because
it's like 20 years of game plus alternative sources to everything that you've just got to go ahead and try and do through data entry.
Yeah, exactly. And also, this is a question actually I got a lot about the wiki. It's not a lore wiki specifically. It is a general wiki for all of Monster Hunter, which is a lot, yeah. But if anyone wants to check it out and use it, obviously, we will be overjoyed. It's monsterhunterwiki.org. And it is a good source for lore, barring the fact that it's incomplete currently. Because there are a couple of extra wrinkles that I wanted to get at as well regarding the lore. And this is maybe the hardest one to resolve, both as a content creator and as a like article writer on the wiki, or just as a fan, which is that the particular way that Monster Hunter, the first game, was developed has left it with a lot of sort of leftovers of its original draft that the development team has more or less revitalized into mythologies and legends within the world of Monster Hunter. So when Monster Hunter was first devised, it began development 4 or 5 years before it released, as far as we know, if I'm not getting my dates muddled up.
So something close to 1999,
yes.
2000, turn of the millennium.
Yes, exactly. And it was originally devised more like a game similar to what we eventually got with Dragon's Dogma. It was originally meant to be an action game where the big premise is that you go into these ancient ruins and steal treasure from under the bellies of sleeping dragons and then battle the dragons. That idea obviously got eventually turned into something more unique, something more iconic, I would say. But a lot of that stuff has stayed in the DNA of the game's lore. This is especially evident if you sort of read a lot of the character dialogue in Monster Hunter 1, where there's just a lot more ambiguity regarding, like, oh, the ancient civilization, people of the ancient times, dragons and wyverns and whatnot. There's a much bigger focus on the mystery of history in the first few games, which of course is another layer of subjectivity and ambiguity that causes issues down the line, as I'm sure we'll get to talk about looking at these questions.
Yeah. It's kind of an incredible thing to see now with the more modern Monster Hunter games, because where there was a lot of ambiguity, now there is a little bit less of it, and it feels as though, particularly with Wilds, Capcom has been very happy to give some direct answers, perhaps not about the whole world, but at least about the section that the players experience in front of them. I mean, I should probably go ahead and say for everybody right away that if I haven't said it in the 2-minute intro before on my end of things, there will inevitably be spoilers with discussions going forward. But
yes.
Yeah, I'm so glad to get that out of the way first with regards to like asking, because honestly, getting into any universe is the foundational thing. You know, over on my side of the pond, so to speak, with Destiny, which is the game I mainly cover, we're very lucky. We have a group called the Ishtar Collective. They have literally curated and collected almost everything in the entire game. And they're just kind of like the definitive source for anything that's been said in game, anything that's been recorded. And we also have a YouTube channel over there called Destiny Lore Vault, which any conversation, any bit of dialogue, any bit of NPC, just sort of like random chatter that's in the background, they've recorded all of it. So
that's incredible. Yeah,
we're incredibly lucky as a community to have just resources like that have allowed us to keep hold of all of these things. So, you know, that's great for us. But it you know, it's another thing to go ahead and talk about another franchise that has been on multiple platforms that started back in 2004, if I'm not mistaken, with the first release. So it's just, I mean, there's a lot to consider. And that's before you even take into account the fact that there's 30 plus art books, all of which are not originally in English, which is where I think most of the Western fans will sit there and have translations for. Or rather would want to get a translation for. And again, there's even further problems with that, because it's not just the fact that it's not in their native language, there's also like a lost in translation factor. So like one of my favorite examples from Destiny is just English does not have it just does not have gendered words in the same way that some other languages do. So yeah, recently Destiny had a piece of content, I say recently, it was a year and a bit ago, which was called Warlord's Ruin, but a German fan got in touch with me and said, hey, in this instance, the word warlord here is gendered as feminine, so it's a female warlord in question, and it turned out, that's absolutely correct. So like, there's little bits and pieces that we lose through localizations, and that just ultimately means that context across different languages and meaning and the actual implication of what's being put forward by words is often lost in the translations. So yeah, there's so many fascinating boundaries and barriers to it, but just being able to lift some of those in the ways that you guys have and the way that you have with your content as well, it's honestly a privilege to even be in the same kind of position where, you know, you're even just helping slightly lift the veil, but it sounds like you are very involved on the Monster Hunter side of things. So yeah,
I mean, I am, first of all, I'm overjoyed to hear that at least the Destiny community has that sorted out so well, because that's kind of a dream to just have like, a vault of everything. Of course, with Monster Hunter, that is just so difficult. There's just so much. But yeah, I mean, I also feel very privileged and very happy to be able to, you know, get people excited about something like this. Because when I first started getting into the Monster Hunter games sort of seriously, which was with World, I had played Monster Hunter 3 before, but didn't click. When I first started getting into it, I was really disappointed that there just wasn't a big enough push to clarify things, to like have things collated in a way that was enjoyable to sift through. At the time when I started, the only real source for lore was the fandom wiki, which, you know, is in a state that pushed us to make our separate wiki. So it's not exactly the premier source. It's full of information that is kind of outdated or outright unclear how it even got there, seemingly not connected to any real source. So yeah, I am very happy that we've been able to sort of move past that and push for a bit more clarity. Now, speaking of clarity,
absolutely.
I've been waffling a lot, so I wanna like loop back around to your question, which is where should people go to get started with Monster Hunter lore?
Yes.
You pretty much have to consider three things. First of all, take it as a shared mythos that is presented subjectively by the characters in the universe, rather than an objective account of cold hard facts. Just accepting that will already help you a lot into like not getting too lost in the details of, oh, but how does this match with this? It's a mythos. It's people having opinions and people having perspectives that do not match sometimes between the games and between lore books, because they're subjective and because it allows Capcom to change things down the line, you know. There's a functional aspect to that as well. Now, if you want to get started with just getting into the lore through the internet, your best bets are to either use the new wiki once it is up and running properly, or even use it already and just, you know, keep in mind that it isn't complete. And if you feel like you know something that you would want to add, join it and take care of that. I'll definitely give you a text saying, hey, where's the source? Or follow creators who are trying to do the work and trying to get that information out there. Now, I'm obviously one of them, but if for whatever reason my content isn't the thing you're looking for, you have Band Lagiacrus and Lutyrannus and Gagiero Celtus, who are all people whose info I can gladly send you by later if you want to add it into the description.
Absolutely. The only one I've heard of from that group is Band Lagiacrus, who I reached out to way back in Worlds when I did some of my content. They were also a very helpful source when it came down to things, and I was just incredibly happy to have just anyone who was a foothold within the world at that point, because yeah, it is in some ways it feels a little impenetrable.
Yes.
But, sorry, you were saying, continue on.
Absolutely, no problem. And yeah, Band for a long time was pretty much the single guy doing Monster Hunter lore in English. So that's definitely a great place to start, his page. Now, if you are willing to spend some money and actually like read a book, one of the 4 books that have been translated into English is actually a lore book. It is Monster Hunter World, the official complete works, which is, coincidentally, I think one of my favorite lore books in Monster Hunter. It is humongous, has information on basically anything you could imagine in Monster Hunter World, not Iceborne. That is a separate book, has never been translated. But it is a great place to start. If you just want to read like an English book that is high quality and will give you like a good amount of information on one game specifically. It's the first book I got and I really loved it, even though it's very unwieldy. It's so big. But yeah, that would be, I guess, my answer regarding where you should start with the lore. Creators that you like, the new Monster Hunter Wiki, and Monster Hunter World, the official complete works.
Okay, that is amazing. And just the ability to sit there and now say, hey, here is your jumping off point, explore from out there. I think that's actually something very valuable to people, because again, a universe that has 20 years worth of world building and mythos behind it, it can feel very impenetrable. You know,
Yes.
I'm from a community that has half of that, and I already know what that feels like. You know, it's one of the biggest problems when it comes to fans having a coherent understanding of the setting. So yeah, I'm so glad to have an answer on that in particular. But from here on out, further questions kind of cover some stuff that is very much considered spoilers, if not for Monster Hunter Wilds, then perhaps for other things in the series. So again, I'll reiterate from here on out, complete spoilers on everything. And with that, yeah, I really want to jump into a question about Wilds, because campaign, first of all, I think it's fair to say that this is one of the best, if not the best, stories that Monster Hunter's had, but it also has some very interesting throwbacks, and in particular, there's some throwbacks regarding the final boss of the campaign. I say final boss, and this last bit is not something I've actually put in my question, because it's something that occurred to me. The final bosses of the campaign, being namely the Guardian Arkveld and Zoh Shia. There is a lot of buzz around them in particular. I know that Guardian Arkveld's facial and horn structure has kind of been called out as something that is similar to a very old piece of artwork that we'll talk about later. But I think Zoh Shia is where we really should start. And the question is simply this. With all of the old mythos around the games, and with, shall we say, the attacks and animation sets of that boss in particular, is there a relationship between Zoh Shia and Fatalis? What is your take on that? Because, of course, somewhat similar body structure, minus the massive hands on the wings. Definitely got some elements of what would be considered a black dragon. It's definitely got the attacks of all three Fatalises, for that matter. And yeah, I just really want to get your take on this. How do you reckon this correlates with older Monster Hunter lore? And given everything we learn from Monster Hunter Wilds in the campaign there, what do you think has actually gone on with this? Guardian Fatalis, maybe some kind of chimeric morph of the three, some kind of response where it's been corrupted by Fatalis over time? Like, what's happened? What do you reckon?
So I guess I should start with saying that the fact that Wyveria and the whole event with Zoh Shia is said to have taken place 1,000 years ago is very interesting, because 1,000 years ago is also when we know that an event took place called the Great Dragon Calamity. This is something that was explicitly mentioned in the Iceborne lore book, sort of in context of us meeting Fatalis at the end of Iceborne. The Great Dragon Calamity is a concept that has sort of existed in the games as an undercurrent for a long time. You can find references to it all the way back in Monster Hunter 1. And despite that, we don't actually know that much about it. But we do know, presumably, that the Great Dragon Calamity was the event that included Fatalis' destruction of the Kingdom of Shrade. Now, the fact that that event and Wyveria's fall at the hands of Zoh Shia were both 1,000 years ago makes me feel like there has to be a connection. Because you're absolutely right. Zoh Shia uses a lot of attacks from the various Fatalis versions. I've heard people say that it has attacks from other Elder Dragons, although I didn't double check, but it definitely seems plausible to me. So with that in mind, I think the way I'm thinking of this is that Zoh Shia is either the thing whose creation caused Fatalis' rampage across the lands, ending in the destruction of Shrade, or Zoh Shia was created as a way to fight back against Fatalis after the people of Wyveria saw what happened to Shrade. And I want to be very clear, there is nothing indicating that either of this is the case. This is just how the pieces fit together in my brain, because of that 1,000-year mention. That aside, would I say that Zoh Shia is a Guardian Fatalis? I think that's fair. I think it has enough in common to the point where it is definitely meant to be an assumption that you make by the developers. I think it is intentionally meant to drive you towards that thought. And I'm very interested to see if we see more of Zoh Shia in the title updates. Because, as many people have probably noticed by now, Zoh Shia gives no armors, no weapons, and the fight is entirely non-repeatable. Which is very bizarre. And I could imagine it coming back for high rank in one of the upcoming title updates.
If not high rank, then conceivably, if ever they have an expansion to Wilds, which, given the player response, I think is unbelievably likely, then maybe it ends up being a master rank quest or something along those lines.
Yeah, possibly. I could definitely see that. I mean, we saw something similar with Xenojiva in World, eventually receiving an adult version in Iceborne with Safi Jiva. So I'd be not surprised if we get that. That's also kind of why I'm a little hesitant to make any definitive calls on Zoh Shia, because I think its story, as far as direct information goes, isn't done yet. But I definitely think they want us to see it as related to Fatalis in some kind of way. One thing that I've seen, and again, this is entirely a theory, there's no evidence for that, but one thought that I saw floating around in certain comment sections that I kind of like is that seeing Fatalis' awakening in Shrade and yada yada, the people of Wyveria created Zoh Shia by using something from Fatalis, like leftover scales or whatever, and that material eventually corrupted Zoh Shia, because Fatalis, it's the vibe it has in the lore is almost like a natural disaster, more so than elder dragons. Just this purely destructive entity that affects everything in its vicinity. So I could see there being a sort of an aspect of corruption going on here. But again, my take is there's definitely a connection, and I'm interested to see where this goes.
And like, to pick up on that a little bit, it makes a lot of sense because, I mean, elder dragons generally are quite literally, by definition, a force of nature.
Yes.
You know, they literally change the world around them to the point where if you go near the kingdom of Shrade, you can kind of see the remnant energies of Fatalis. Like, the area is in permanent desecration, not just from fire, but life doesn't go there, you know? It avoids Fatalis. And then the corruption aspect you were talking on, I think that's also one of the more fascinating aspects to the lore, because, I mean, the whole thing of Fatalis materials leading to the corruption of whatever they're kind of in proximity or attached to or forged into is completely within the bounds of what is precedented, because, I mean, that's the definition of what you see on the Hunter armor for Fatalis, if I'm not mistaken, right? You see that they get corrupted.
Yeah, I am not entirely sure if that is something that is actually in the games, or if that is, again, one of those cases where a more ambiguous description kind of went through a game of telephone. You actually got me here. I did not double check that before we started.
No, that's entirely my bad. And
no, that's my bad. Some lore master I am.
I mean, hey, you know, this is also pointing out a good thing here, though, because there's a lot of assumptions that are made on this, and, you know, it's important to go ahead and get those things double-checked. I did not prep you with that question. My apologies. But, you know, this just goes to show, right? Like, we have people sitting here and talking about Fatalis, and obviously there is a corruptive element to that. I think it's fair to say that much. But, you know, I've heard people online sitting there and saying that hunters who make armor out of the Fatalis turn into a Fatalis eventually, or become its avatars or something. So it's, you know, the back and forth it's got question marks.
Yeah, because the other dimension to that is, of course, that there is, as it is ambiguous, some people will just take the coolest possible interpretation from that and run with it, because, of course, it's a video game, you're meant to have fun with it. And it is sometimes hard to separate that after the fact from what is actually stated specifically. Regarding Fatalis armor, I want to say that the description in-game is generally a little more ambiguous than that, but I can't say for sure. I don't have it in mind. I do know that item descriptions, and especially armor descriptions in Monster Hunter, tend to be very hyperbolic. So it's hard to take them at face value sometimes. Like, you know, Gormagala parts are described to essentially swallow up light like a black hole, which I don't know if that's true. That seems a little out there, but...
You know, that could just be very descriptive writing, according to the fact that it's got those... I'm trying to remember one of the videos I saw on this, which I don't know if it was yours or not, but yeah, Gormagala basically sheds a bunch of particles in order to see the environment. So that could literally just be a thing of like, hey, it's surrounding particulate, the light gets blocked, you know? That could be all it means. Alternatively, hey, this is some kind of dark, unnatural creature that ultimately consumes light around it and swallows the natural fabric of the universe. It's, you know, somewhere between the two maybe, or it's just very creative writing.
Exactly. And I think this is this sort of middle ground of trying to analyze everything as critically as possible, with an eye for understanding this as hyperbolic writing, versus taking it at face value and constructing a mythos of these ungodly creatures that violate the laws of reality. I think that gap between those two extremes is where Monster Hunter lives. Because that's another thing that a lot of people tend to forget, is that the Hunters Guild is not a scientifically advanced organization. It is a group of people trying to make sense of the world in a setting where technology is, in some aspects, kind of advanced, but mostly, you know, medieval in nature. And the understanding of the world around them is also colored by that. You know, I often cover the evolutionary trees of monsters on my channel, because each of the lore books comes with an updated evolutionary tree diagram of all the monsters, which is one of my favorite things in the world. And those trees quite often don't make a ton of sense, because they're written by people in universe who aren't modern scientists, but just field researchers observing things, noting that this one monster has a similar claw to this other monster, and then putting them into the same clade. But speaking of, creative writing or creative ideas being interpreted, one good example of that regarding Fatalis is, oh god, what is it called? The 100 Dragon Blood Call? Where,
what? I've never heard of this, but that sounds amazing.
Yeah, so I believe it's in Monster Hunter Freedom 1. One of the hunting magazines mentions an old poem regarding Fatalis, where it appears when wyverns are slain. And coincidentally, in many of the Monster Hunter games, or the early ones at least, including Freedom Unite, I believe, the condition to unlocking Fatalis is hunting 100 Rathalos and Rathians. Now, people have taken this to mean that, Fatalis emerges in vengeance of its slain draconic brethren. Or it could just be that he's a super boss meant to be only found after you do an absurd amount of grinding. And so you can... so you can sort of read this both ways, and people have. So I think this is a good illustrative example of how far you can take it, but also how limited a lot of the explicit text actually is.
I'm trying to just remember this as well. Is this the, it goes something along the lines of Fatalis.
Yes.
Give our...
Blood is crunched, blood is sucked dry, bone is crunched. Yes, that one.
Yes, absolutely. I knew I remembered it from there. I just didn't know it was called the 100 Dragon Blood Call, which...
I think that might also be a fan term, actually. I remember it popping up, but the other thing is also, and this loops back around to the translation thing, is that most people's familiarity with old Monster Hunter lore comes from Freedom and Freedom Unite, which are both games whose translations are not ideal. I think because Freedom Unite feels like such a huge game, with so much content in it, people don't realize that this was a game that was thrown together in 18 months. And the translation was, as far as I'm aware, not much, didn't have much more time than that. So you get a lot of weirdness in the translations, which also means that sort of carries over into people's sort of mind map of how the lore works. So yeah, as an additional thing to keep in mind, especially if you start with Freedom Unite.
Yeah, wow. I have to say as well, I'm so glad to be able to touch on a topic like that, because it's always struck me as one of the coolest aspects of the world of Monster Hunter. Not just the fact that you have this, what I would consider to be kind of almost a final world boss in so many regards, but also an entity that I think exemplifies what most Elder Dragons kind of are in a certain sense. And it's a bit of a vague term, but Elder Dragons, as I mentioned earlier, they're kind of these entities that defy the logic of the world to a certain extent. They are almost a divine presence in some cases. And I think there's a few that are very obvious about that, Kirin, for example.
Yes.
But Fatalis is the first one where it really, for me, sort of, I read things around it in the game and through some of the extra subsequent lore, and it felt like a vengeful god. There was there's this call to the idea that this thing hates humanity. And I think that that's something which was always really fascinating to me, just purely because, the world of Monster Hunter generally doesn't, obviously you fight monsters and you're doing it to protect the environment and the ecosystem, but it's not really a game that has villains for the most part, right?
Yeah.
Like, even in World, when you sit there and look at, say, Nergigante or Safijiva and, Xenojiva by extension, in some instances you can sit there and say, like, these are calamitous entities that are genuinely threatening. In other instances, it's very clear that, these are entities that actually do have a place in the natural order, and whether we're actually doing the right thing by killing them is sometimes a big old question mark. But Fatalis is surprisingly cut and dry when it comes to motivation, It's not necessarily there for food,
Yeah, it has never been observed feeding, as far as the lore is concerned. And actually, it's really good that you touch on Elder Dragons as a presence, because one thing that I don't think a lot of people know is that especially early on, Elder dragons had this tendency to be associated with ores and rock. So you got Teostra that eats coal. You've got Kirin, whose horn is made up of an unknown ore. You've got dragons that travel underground and create tunnels. And now also, with the wormways or land spines in Wilds, you have this idea of draconic energy traveling through the veins of the earth. And that is something that's always struck me as particularly interesting. Whereas regular monsters are very much made in the image of animals, Elder dragons feel like they're almost meant to be these guardians emerging from the soil itself. Which again, not something explicitly said in the lore. Do not use this in your arguments online. But it is a thought that I've had and that I find super interesting when it comes to the world of Monster Hunter. And it is also interesting to also see how the role of Elder Dragons has changed across the games. Because in Monster Hunter 1, Elder Dragons were genuinely a thing you needed to go out of your way to even encounter. Because there was only 3, 2 of which were online exclusive. There was only Lao Shanlang, Kirin, and Fatalis. And so that idea of them being these extremely rare, powerful forces of nature has kind of evolved to them being just a thing you encounter in the games that is really, really powerful. But despite that air of, as you said, sort of this air of mystique, air of affecting the environment has remained, which I'm really glad it has. But yeah, I guess to sort of put a bow on my very long answer regarding Fatalis and Zoh Shia and all that is, Fatalis is cool. A lot of the information about him is very nebulous by nature. A very famous anecdote about him is that he was specifically designed with the idea of clashing with the other monster designs, where a lot of the other designs are fairly unique, with that sort of Monster Hunter flair. Fatalis is just a dragon. And that is very much intentional. It's also why you fight him in Castle Shrade and not a regular map, because the team wanted it to just be a complete contrast to how you play the game regularly, where you navigate naturalistic environments. Whereas here, you're sitting in the ruins of man-made structures, fighting something that just looks like a mythological dragon.
Implying an implicit division between the rest of the game, which is a part of the natural world, and Fatalis, which is kind of above it, or separate from it at very least. Yes.
Actually, here's another fun little morsel for the listeners, is that the flame that Fatalis spews, thanks to the Iceborne book, has an official name. It is called the Kalpa flame. Kalpa is a concept from Hinduism, which is the fire that will end the world. So,
Yeah, it's kind of appropriate considering the Iceborne iteration of Fatalis, which, I mean, if you don't get in cover in time for the second wave of the flame there, you will just cart. Like, it's as simple as that.
Yes.
There's no guarding against it.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of Fatalis, and this actually leads us very well onto the next question, with a lot of the knowledge of dragons like Fatalis being nebulous, there is also a classification, or at very least a description of that group of dragons, including the 3 Fatalis variants and Zoh Shia, which gets bounded about a lot. And that's Black Dragon. And my question to you really there is, I've heard of Black Dragons, I've heard also of Calamity class dragons, but are either of those actual terms within the lore? What can you say on that front of things? Because I've heard some pushback to the idea of what is or isn't a Black Dragon, and whether the term should even be used. And I'm not quite sure where things go on that, but I think it's an important thing to discuss and define, because I mean, those are probably defined as some of the most important world-ending threats. And I mean literally world-ending, because if I was going to sit there and put forward my, what is probably either incorrect or incomplete knowledge, the only other Black Dragon I know of is Dire Moralis, which, again, boiled a sea. Just destroyed all life in it. So what's your take? What do you know on that front of things?
Well, finally, a question that has a simple, straightforward answer. Black Dragon is not an official classification in any capacity.
Gotcha.
At least not in the way that Elder Dragon, Flying Wyvern, and all that stuff is. So, in Japanese, every monster gets a nickname. And that nickname is used specifically for its introduction in the game and for its materials. So, for example, Rathalos's nickname is Flame Wyvern. So all Rathalos materials, all the stuff that you would call a Rathalos scale in the English version of the game, is actually called Flame Wyvern scale in Japanese. It's just a textual difference between the original text and all the translations. The nickname for certain monsters includes the word black. You have Fatalis, who is the Black Dragon, and all of his relatives who also get that same title. White Fatalis, I believe, is Ancestral Dragon, but they're grouped together in that. You've got Miralis, which I believe is the Burning Black Dragon, and you've got Alatreon, who is the Blazing Black Dragon. That's it. Those three are the only monsters that can in any way be called Black Dragons due to their nicknames. Now, the reason this idea of Black Dragon as a classification has taken off is because of an entirely separate trend that existed within Capcom up until 2019, which was the concept of forbidden monsters. These were monsters that they wanted to keep special by essentially never mentioning them in marketing and pretending that they didn't exist. They were excluded from official guidebooks. They were often only included in art books as like, ooh, a sketch of something, we don't know what. And they were generally excluded or only hinted at in the actual lore books. Now, in 2019, right around the time when Iceborne announced that it was bringing back Fatalis, they lifted the ban on forbidden monsters and started discussing them openly in one single book. It is in fact called the Forbidden Monsters book by some people.
Wow.
Yeah. And that book is just full of information regarding the design of Fatalis, the design of Dire Miralis, of Alatreon, which again, those three and their various variations are the only ones included in that. And people have taken that to mean that there is a special classification for them. Officially, there just isn't. They're just very, very powerful Elder Dragons. Now, there are other titles that have been used. You mentioned Calamity Class or Calamity Dragon. Another one you will find is First Class Dangerous Monster. Those are descriptions that are used generally once in one of the lore books to describe a specific monster and then never again. So there just isn't enough information to use them as anything like a real classification. I believe the final boss of Rise is the only thing that's ever called a Calamity Class Dragon. Which, again, just not a lot of information to go off of. Now, is it valuable to think of black dragons as this concept in the world of these world-ending dragons? Maybe, but it is something that exists largely in the minds of fans. On that note, it'll be very interesting to see what Zoh Shia's official Japanese nickname is, because we don't get it in the game because it doesn't have materials that it drops.
Of course, yeah. And again, for those who've not got there yet but are still watching this, it only ever drops Guardian materials, Guardian Scales, and Guardian Blood, for example.
Exactly.
Which, oh man, that's it's really good to have clarification on that, because ultimately, yeah, this is one of those things which I think for a lot of the members of the community is kind of wrapped up in mythos. Yep. It's not really given any super clear. I mean, I didn't even know that it was because of nicknames that were given, or the the Japanese interpretation. But again, I suppose it's another moment of lost in translation for us who are using a localization of any of the games, because it's we do these things in English. And I mean, ultimately, good to have that clarity on it as well, especially because I think there is a lot of there's so many questions about what is or isn't the thing without even questioning whether the term Black Dragon is even something appropriate to it. But yeah, it's nice to know that that is actually something which has an origin, has a root, has a reason, but isn't necessarily something to be used. Yeah. Oh, go on.
No, you go.
I was going to ask, if you ever saw more of this kind of being brought forward, and if ever there was like an official document being like the guild now authorizes the use of this terminology to describe certain world-ending events, how would you see that as being deployed? Do you reckon that that's something which might happen on every single Monster Hunter game, or do you reckon that these are special threats for sort of only the moments when it really makes sense? Because, I mean, we've only ever seen Dire Miralis in one game. Fatalis barely ever comes back, and it's kind of an anomaly for the sake of Iceborne. but has been in a bunch of different games and a bunch of different iterations in the older ones. And there are other threats that aren't necessarily world-ending, but are definitely world-shaking. I feel as though the idea of Black Dragon kind of leaves some things thinly defined, whereas if it's just more general, you get to sort of play around a lot with the concepts of the world if you're Capcom. It's like, yeah, what's your take on that, if that makes sense as a question?
Well, the thing is, something like Black Dragon or First Class Dangerous Monsters propagating across the fandom, I think is an indication that people kind of instinctually understand that there has to be some kind of hierarchy to Elder Dragons, because certain Elder Dragons are just obviously not as threatening as others, right? If you think of something like Nergigante, sure, it's dangerous, but it doesn't quite stack up to Fatalis. So I do think if I were Capcom, I would eventually address that, but I also do not think they will. And the reason for that is a man named Kaname Fujioka, who is in many ways the creator of Monster Hunter. I don't actually know if you or the audience knows this, but the people who are currently developing Monster Hunter are pretty much the same people who developed the first game. The team has stayed very consistent across the entire time that the games have been coming out. And Fujioka specifically is generally seen as in charge of the lore and the world building. He generally drafts out what he calls the worldview of each game. And he, as a creative, loves a certain degree of ambiguity. And he loves keeping things grounded but nebulous. He famously opposed the idea of elemental attacks in Monster Hunter because he thought it was too outlandish. He said that about Lagiacrus in Monster Hunter 3, which is funny to think about. So I think that with that in mind, we probably won't ever see an actual classification for monsters that are world-ending, because from the perspective of the team, the logic probably is, well, if it's world-ending, there's no point in classifying it, because it is pretty much singular. With that in mind, I'm sure we'll keep getting these sort of one-off classifications, calling Narwa from Rise a Calamity-class dragon. As I said, I'm very curious to see what they use to describe Zoh Shia in the eventual Wilds lorebook, because every game eventually gets a bespoke lorebook. I think I forgot to mention that earlier. But yeah, I don't think we'll ever get an in-game official classification that is in any way comparable to how stuff like Elder Dragon or Flying Wyvern functions.
And in a certain sense, if it's all perspective anyway, it's kind of valuable on its own that it is just perspective and it is just ambiguous, right?
Yeah.
Because, just describing something as a Calamity class, for example, or as a Black Dragon gives you the vibe of, it was important to these people, and it was scary enough for them to give this particular moniker to it, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Not that Black Dragon is used within the games, rather that it's, it's different as you've discussed. But
yeah,
you get the idea.
Yeah, because one thing that will actually happen in games quite often is they will talk about the Black Dragon, which is just Fatalis.
Yes. Speaking of things that have been bounded about in the games and such, I've got to ask you about the ancient civilization. There are so many questions that I have regarding this, but it's also one of these moments of, for one, I'm sure the information is very limited, obviously, by the nature of, it's a post-apocalypse that we basically exist in within Monster Hunter, and the ruins of that apocalypse are all around us. But the ancient civilization is also something where the amount of lore that actually exists on it being so nebulous leaves a lot of questions. And then, in Wilds, all of a sudden, we encounter Wyveria, which at very least is this massive city, if not an entire city-state, that kind of spans the land all the way into the sort of Forbidden Lands itself. And it's got the energy of the Dragon Torch, and it's got this fascinating, crazy degree of floating architecture that you can still see in the Ice Shard Cliffs.
Yep.
It's a massive civilization all of a sudden in the middle of a Monster Hunter game, where previously they have been very coy about talking about anything to do with an ancient civilization outside of whispers and rumors. So I guess my real question is it okay if we define some things? First of all, Wyveria and the ancient civilization, the same, part of something bigger, something where Wyveria is just kind of a smaller subset of ancient peoples? Does the ancient civilization as a term even have any kind of merit to being used? Does it even technically exist in the same way that we've perhaps got the community conception of? What is the kind of lowdown on all that?
So the short answer, and the one no one wants to hear, is that it's unclear. The long answer is that Wyveria is probably not a world-spanning, massive, singular ancient civilization in the way a lot of people sometimes think of it. In fact, I do not believe that the world of Monster Hunter is meant to have ever had, this one singular ancient people that, spread into all corners of the world. The reason for that is that we actually get to see a lot of different ancient ruins all across the Monster Hunter games, many of which seem quite different architectures, they have different mythologies attached to them. So I think the best way to think about it is to just think about it the way you do about the real world, right? If someone asked you, what is the ancient civilization of our real human world?
You'd ask which one.
Exactly. Right? You wouldn't be able to name a single one as the main one. You would say, well, you had Rome, you had Persia, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had God knows what else. You had China, right? So you can't easily identify the ancient civilization in real life, and I think the Monster Hunter world works similarly. Now, in your question, you mentioned that we are in a post-apocalypse in Monster Hunter, and I want to push back on that. There is nothing...
Please do, go for it.
Yeah, there's nothing that suggests that. At least not in the sense of like there was some big advanced civilization that disappeared all at once. That is not really confirmed in any meaningful way. There's obviously been ancient civilizations that were more or less advanced, depending on which one we're talking about. But the post-apocalypse angle, as far as I can tell, is something that pretty much only exists out of people interpreting Fatalis's emergence in Shrade as a sort of apocalypse, which one could look at it that way, but is far, far from being hard canon. So, just push back on that a little. And yeah, I think Wyveria was very much its own thing, its own concise civilization located in the Forbidden Lands. But if we ever return to more lore regarding the ancient civilizations, I could see there being something where, like you had certain ancient civilizations in the real world communicating with each other, dealing with each other, Egypt and Rome and whatnot. I could imagine there being some connection there as well in that regard. But yeah, that's sort of my take. I think it's multiple civilizations that have existed across all time, and Wyveria is just one of them.
And one that now has a remarkable degree of, stuff left behind from it for sure, but actual documentation, because the world itself lends us all these interesting hints about what it was.
Yes.
Whereas if we look at Shrade, realistically, the biggest hints we get to it are the few kind of perspectives we have on Shrade that relate to Fatalis. So it's, all of that, as you've said, is also sort of spun up in mystery. I'm glad for you to have pushed back on it, though, because again, this is kind of why I asked. The whole thing of the ancient civilization existing is something I've gotten wrong, It's definitely one of those things where it's easy to sort of bound everything up in these kind of rumors of the world that existed before, but it just goes to show, all of this stuff kind of takes on a life of its own based on, the small bits and pieces that exist within our own kind of consciousness and understanding of an idea. But the way you describe it absolutely makes a lot more sense, because, of course, it's not just one ancient civilization. The ruins in, the old jungle forest biomes that you would have gotten in Monster Hunter 2, for example, are not going to necessarily be the same as what you might see in, Shrade, and they might not be the same as, the ancient massive tower where you go up it to fight a bunch of elder dragons, all of these different constructs and whatnot. Yeah, it makes sense that they had different groups behind them.
Yeah, and another way we sort of can infer that as well is that a lot of these ruins do have myths and legends associated with them in the lore books, and they tend to be quite different. So, for example, in the jungle that you find in Monster Hunter 2, Freedom Unite, recently remade in Monster Hunter Rise, the ruins there and the people that live there are said to have worshipped specifically Kushala Daora. and to have it pushed out and eventually fought off when the people turned on their god. Which is a very different story from something like the people near Yukumo village and the Misty Peaks, who are said to have had priests that were trying to control monsters using ancient rituals, right? There's just a different flavor of culture to all of these different places that makes me believe that we are not dealing with one globe-spanning civilization that was so advanced and then suddenly disappeared and now we're living in the ruins of it. But this is also kind of where the thing I mentioned earlier comes in about how Monster Hunter was developed, because originally Monster Hunter was a game about finding endless ruins, venturing into them and finding monsters guarding treasures. And I think the presence of ruins and the undercurrents of ancient civilizations very much comes from that old DNA sticking around.
And if we're going to if we're going to talk about some stuff and sort of disperse a few rumors, there's one I absolutely want to touch on here, and that is the perfect or equal dragon weapon, as it is sometimes talked about.
Yes.
This is, I'm pretty sure that this is one of those things which has been pushed back on and touched on by a whole bunch of people. If I'm getting this correct, the origin of this is a single art concept from one of the old art books, which never actually made it into the game. And because it is a concept, not necessarily something that exists, it's not necessarily canon. But I want to go ahead and get your take on it. For those who, please feel free to push back on me if this description is in any way wrong. For those who don't know, this is supposedly the idea that way back when humanity, or people who existed in that ancient time 1,000 years ago, created a weapon which was basically an amalgamation of monster parts and sort of cyborg machine bits that would ultimately be a weapon equal to an elder dragon or a dragon of some sorts. And that's, I'm sure I'm butchering a lot of that before even getting to the fact that the entire idea is basically not technically canon in the way that it's often seen there. So, what is your take on that? What is and is not true? I'd love to go ahead and disperse some rumor here.
Well, one thing that's important to understand, I hate that I have to keep going on these tangents, but this is just how Monster Hunter works. So I really apologize. It's important to understand that concept art in Monster Hunter doesn't work the way it works in a lot of other games, because the team pretty much never throws out a concept outright. What it instead does is it keeps it on the back burner, or, in some cases, canonizes it as uncertain information. The most famous case of this is their initial monster designs, many of which get repurposed into what they call extinct species or unknown species, where you find them in art books saying, oh, this is an unknown relative of Tigrex, and it's just an early draft for it. With that in mind, something being concept art in Monster Hunter doesn't exclude it from being quote-unquote canon. Now, the equal dragon weapon, you touched on that it only showed up in an art book. It's actually even more, it's even more of a specific case, because it shows up in the very first lore book of Monster Hunter as a myth, with the note that these are the rumors told of an encounter with this thing in an ancient ruin. And then it got reprinted into an art book that excluded that explanation of it being a rumor. And that art book got translated into English, which is how a lot of people first encountered it.
And now then it ultimately becomes a game of just like, okay, 3 different layers of interpretation and sort of obfuscation.
Yes. So the equal dragon weapon is... the best way to describe it is it's meant to be a myth within the world of Monster Hunter. It is not to be taken as literal canon. I don't think so, at least, because of how many layers of obfuscation you're dealing with. However, with Zoh Shia, we now have the moment where the team more or less grabbed into their pile of old ideas and revitalized the equal dragon weapon, because that's more or less what Zoh Shia is pulling from, right? This sort of construct that is meant to protect its civilization from potentially an elder dragon, or at least war, as it is said in the game. Now, the equal dragon weapon is also very possibly a remnant again from that very first game draft. where it could have been a super boss, I don't know. I don't think anyone does. But I do think the best way to consider and think about the Equal Dragon weapon is as an in-universe myth. It is not entirely like fan fiction. Like, people in the universe of Monster Hunter probably have heard of the idea, but it's probably not to be taken as literal canon. Same with the Great Dragon War that is attached to the Equal Dragon weapon conceptually. It is likely meant to be just one of those stories that exists in a world that doesn't do the best job of keeping its own history and is subject to unreliable narrators and historical confusion.
This definitely goes ahead and casts many of the questions I've seen in a different light, and I'm very glad for it. It's also one of those interesting moments where if you actually look at the image itself, I think that even with the designs of Arkveld,
yes,
Capcom is kind of calling back to it, because one of the more distinctive features of that old piece of concept art is the head, where it's got these two horns on either side and then one in the very center, which mimics exactly the facial structure of Arkveld, which is just kind of a really interesting thing, which feels like a very obvious throwback to it, especially given the nature of Guardians within the story of Monster Hunter Wild.
Yes, I think this is, again, what we're seeing here is the benefit of the development and writing team of Monster Hunter having largely stayed the same, so that they can pull from ideas they had 20 years ago. They don't need to guess what they felt and thought, because they were there. They were there writing these concepts. So, yeah, I think this is just a case of an old idea having been sort of in the background as a myth in the world of Monster Hunter for a long time, and now put into the light as a sort of reimagined version of itself.
It's so good to be able to have some clarity on stuff like that. And speaking of, there is one thing which I don't think ever gets confirmed by Capcom, but I think is kind of transparent with the way that some characters are designed. I've heard a lot of chatter online and just from people playing the game that there are a lot of characters that people have grown really attached to in this game who are actually returning characters from previous Monster Hunter games. The one that really stands out is Fabius, but I also hear a little bit of like rumor back and forth that Gemma might have been in a previous game as like a younger version of herself. And so I just wanted to get your take on that as well. Is any of that true, do you think? And if so, are there any characters from previous games that you'd love to see returning into Wilds as part of a future story within either an expansion proper or just within a title update?
Again, I'm very happy to have a question that has a fairly simple answer. Both Fabius and Gemma are 99% sure to be returning characters. So Fabius is almost definitely the character Ace Lancer from Monster Hunter 4, who is one of the sort of ace hunters that helps the player track down Gormagala in that game. And in Wilds, Fabius at one point gets to wear his old armor from Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, which is entirely unique to him. His bodyguards specifically mention that he used to be an ace hunter. He has a special relationship with Gormagala, and on his jacket you can find the symbol of the caravan from Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, the group of people that is sort of the main cast of that game. So Fabius is pretty definitely the Ace Lancer. I really don't have any doubt in my mind regarding that. Gemma is also very likely a character called Little Miss Forge, also from Monster Hunter 4, which is, in that game, she's this little girl who the player's party picks up as a blacksmith early on in the game. The reason she's almost definitely the same character is there's a resemblance to her. She has a little plushie that is also present on on Little Miss Forge in 4 Ultimate.
That's the Yan Kutku plushie?
Yes, the little plushie.
I wondered about that.
And if you play far enough into the game, to the point where Fabius is just a character that hangs out at base and you can talk to him, if you pester him enough, he eventually mentions that he met Gemma when she was a child, and that he recalls that she would always stare at one of his friends, Nadia, who is the ace gunner from Monster Hunter 4. That name is actually confirmed. And the coup de grace, Gemma, on the back of her jacket, also has the symbol of the caravan group from Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. So those two characters, I think, are pretty definitely returning. I'd be very, very surprised to be wrong about this. Does that give you some clarity?
It absolutely does. And, it's one of those things of they may never explicitly say it in some of those moments, but, I mean, it would need to be a hell of a debate for it to not be that case.
Yes.
But yeah, at that point, do you reckon that we're going to get characters such as Nadia coming forward and returning? Do you reckon that there's going to be more of the old crew and therefore perhaps more of the old monsters that were sort of pursued? I suppose at that point as well, you have to question if Gore Magala was at the center of the previous sort of story with some of these characters. Do you reckon that we're going to get Shaguru Magala, I think it is? Shagaru Magala, there we go. Which is the evolved state of Gore Magala, for those who are unaware.
Yeah, I think that's pretty certain. I'd be very surprised if we don't get Shagaru. And the thing to remember with Monster Hunter Wilds is that in many ways it is a sequel to Monster Hunter 4 more than it is a sequel to Monster Hunter World. That is both because of certain stylistic choices that they make. You have the sand ship carrying us across the dunes at the start of the game. This is a very iconic image from Monster Hunter 4. You've got Gemma and Fabius. You've got a bigger presence of the guild as a bureaucratic entity, which is also something that 4U really dealt with. Yuya Tokuda, who is the director of Monster Hunter Wilds, also worked as the lead planner, which is sort of a game designer and manager position for Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. So there is a lot of overlap there. Add to that returning characters are actually somewhat common in Monster Hunter. World and Rise are pretty much the only games that did not include many of them. Even World had one. And before that, in every game, you would basically get at least a couple of returning characters. So I think there's a good chance we will meet at least more of the people from 4 Ultimate in the expansion. I think Aiden, who is the ace cadet from Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, who already returned in World as the excitable A-lister. He might return because he also got, his own animated movie on Netflix, so he's clearly someone the team is very fond of. And in addition, I can imagine Julius coming back, who is the ace... Oh god, what is he? I think he's just the ace hunter or the ace leader of the team. He's just this extremely elite hunter that leads the team in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. He's also a fan favorite, and he's part of the group, so I can see him coming back, and why not? Let's have Nadia as well. Let's have the entire group come back. I can see it happening. It is also interesting because through Fabius and Gemma, we get kind of a timeline, right? Because Gemma is a small child in 4 Ultimate, and here she's a grown woman. Fabius is a middle-aged man in 4 Ultimate, and here he is, notably aged. So that's also something interesting to keep in mind, that there is actually a sequentiality to these games.
Yeah, where there must have been at very least 10, if not probably 15 or 20 years having passed between one point and another, right?
Yeah, possibly.
Well, that... Oh man, okay, there's so much more that we could go ahead and open up onto, but I'm also conscious of the fact that this recording is approaching possibly like an hour and a half on the end of the viewers. But I will go ahead and say this. I'm so glad to be able to have this conversation, to be able to just sort of disperse some of the mythology and the rumors, because again, I think that is one of the biggest problems with discussions of this, is that there is a lack of a fundamental baseline of knowledge. And some of that I think is very deliberate and it's very fair, because, worlds are sometimes left as vague and obscure so that you can have these discussions. But knowing where the baseline is and understanding the reasons for certain bits and pieces that fans maybe have run away with somewhat is really important to go ahead and get right, just because it means that we can clarify our conversations about all this later. And I know that I've definitely fallen into that trap when talking about Monster Hunter. That's why I'm so glad to have sat down and talked with you about it, because ultimately, yeah, getting everyone this foundational base of knowledge is pretty important. Honestly, though, I'm so glad to have sat down and been able to speak. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. And, don't beat yourself up if you ever get something wrong, because I am sure there's at least something I said in my stream of consciousness right now that someone's going to debunk me on with some very obscure Japanese source that I hadn't considered yet. That's kind of just the life as a Monster Hunter lore master. You always have to be ready to be corrected. But yeah, I'm glad I could help clear certain things up. is there any question that you still have sort of burning in your mind, like something that isn't as broad, but just a specific thing you're curious about now that you have me here?
Gosh, it's one of those moments where you get put on the spot and sort of everything evaporates from your brain. Yeah, okay, here's one, and I know that it goes all the way back to Fatalis, but that's purely because it's one of my favorite topics within any of the games. Do you reckon that White Fatalis in particular, it actually achieves a degree of what could be considered godhood? I mean, in the intro, which it gets in one of the games, it literally, a black eclipse goes off in the sky and it fills with thunder, and this thing just flies out of there and arrives and perches on its top mount like a god. It's very much one of these things where it feels like it's calling out to some kind of greater presence. What's your take on, I suppose, divinity within Monster Hunter, and maybe seeing if there are elements of the world that reach into that? Particularly Elder Dragons, I guess, but do you reckon gods exist? I think it's the short version of it.
What a simple question.
Small questions. Yeah. Simple question.
I reckon that White Fatalis is at least meant to be seen in that divine light. The inversion from the black dragon to a white dragon with wispy hair and a beard definitely feels like it is meant to be seen as a divine image. In addition, it is called the Ancestral Dragon, which is a pretty loaded title. And there's the additional thing that people don't really think of this much. We don't actually have a confirmation on what the relation is between White Fatalis, Crimson Fatalis, and Black Fatalis. We have some lines about how Crimson Fatalis is just an injured Fatalis, yada yada, but they're never really called subspecies or variants or any of that. So with that in mind, I do think if you look at White Fatalis and feel like you're in the presence of the god of the Monster Hunter universe, that's probably a feeling the developers intended. As for a broader idea of godhood in Monster Hunter, I don't know. I think it's possible. I think there are Elder Dragons that definitely seem like they could be derived from something that isn't entirely explicable by science. And the games also absolutely sort of revel in this idea of, oh, science is grasping at straws, trying its best to understand a world that continuously eludes explanation. That's kind of what Elder Dragons are ultimately. In the Monster Hunter World lore book, the one in English that you can buy and read for yourself if you want, Elder Dragon as a classification is actually defined as a waste bin, where they just put into anything that refuses to be classified otherwise. And
that's why you have like Fatalis, which is a very traditional looking dragon, Diamoralis, which is enormous and can't actually use its wings to fly, and Kirin, all in the same kind of bucket, so to speak.
Yes, and the only thing that really binds most of them together is a substance called Elder Dragon blood, which most of them have. There's some quality in their blood that makes them special. Notably, Fatalis doesn't. Make of that what you will.
Interesting.
But yeah, that will be my answer then.
Yeah, just quickly whip out the crazy one of, hey, what about God at the very end there? That's very typical of me. I'm so sorry to have not prepped you for that question.
All good. Pondering the nature of divinity on a random Monday evening. It's just part of the job.
Yeah, ultimately, it's the moment where you sit there and you're like, yes, but what about the levels of godhood? That's the moment where you've gone in too deep.
We are power scaling God, everyone. Let's go.
Yes. Could God beat Goku? Yes, this is where it ends up being.
I'll leave that one up to the comment section.
Yeah, 100%. Let us know down below in the comments. For that matter, by the way, anyone who is watching, please, I'll take this moment to go ahead and say it. If you have any interest in the lore and ecology that you can find within any of the Monster Hunter games, please go ahead and check out Ocean's channel. Oceaniz. Regardless, the spelling and the actual link to everything, that will be in the description. That is something you can find and watch on your own. Probably some of the most in-depth lore content regarding Monster Hunter that I have taken a moment to watch, and also really great because I noticed this in your videos. You cite your sources whenever you're mentioning something, and you have a little kind of notation in one of the top corners, which for something as For a universe that has this much going on in it, and which has so many sources which you just need to kind of keep in your head all at once, it's really refreshing to sit there and see, so that you have like a degree of certainty behind what you're saying. So if you have any interest in that, please go ahead and check out his channel. That will all be linked in the description. So yeah, please make sure you go ahead and also give a subscription over there and check out some of the stuff, because I'm sure everyone who's watching this has really been enjoying everything to do with Monster Hunter Wilds, and I know I certainly have. This won't be the last video I make on it either, so yes.
Hell yeah. Thank you for calling out the sources. It's something I've worked towards for the last like 2-3 years, and yeah, it's just one of those things I'm personally super invested in, just making sure that there's transparency where I'm getting information from. So yeah, very glad that you appreciated that. And yeah, and I was very happy to be here. And for people who are watching this on my channel, absolutely check out My Name is Bife, who was kind enough to invite me over and have a chat with me. My relationship with Destiny is limited to the first game. I no-lifed it during a summer when I got it on a double discount, but I loved my time with it. And if you have good memories of Destiny 1 or 2, absolutely check out his channel. It'll be linked in the video below for the people who are watching this on my channel. And yeah, thank you for having me, man.
Hey, thank you for taking the time to be on.
As always, a big thank you to all of our patrons and YouTube channel members. I would like to especially thank Molly Mockery, Rose, Zyperius Folkvar, Darkest Matter, Theopus, Bluefish, Morgul Blank, Tacti Wolf, Thyla Zero, Jacob Coleman, Hellbug Hunter, Shebo, M1 Have 1 2, Regal Eagle, Wronger 97, Quali, Matt Hat 124, My Name Gone, The Dollarfish, Sheba, Ryan Hook, Veraxis, Thick, Kuroneko, Zion H.V. Augenson, Alistair, Jacob the Numbnut, Soruka, Sir Newt Newt, Evie, Rambling Robin, Hashi, Black Ace 202, Dissy, Habohim Romir, Magenta, Russell, Vulgar Beast, Person 212, Claire Miboon, Oakwood Tree, Mr. Pyramid, Makoto 2, Geo, Nils Schlatter, Iron Camel, and nah, I'm going to bed. Take care, everyone. I'll see you around.